Good afternoon and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Fulcrum. Today we have Dr. Parag Khanna, who has written a fascinating book titled The Future is Asian. First published in 2019, it covers a broad spectrum of themes such as Asian history, the region's economic rise, and the ongoing Asianization of Asia. One of the biggest themes, the book argues, is that as we are getting used to America first of the world's foremost power, we should also start getting used to the idea of Asia first, which is the world's foremost region. Good afternoon, Parag, and it's good to have you with us here today.
Likewise, William. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go straight into the questions proper. You're right that there's no turning back the clock, Parag, when it comes to Asia's rise, and that Asians see today not as an era of Western dominance, but Asian ascendance. Do you think that the West has really come around to this idea, or do you think Asians themselves accept this idea?
I think Asians themselves have gotten used to the idea of Asia's rise as a structural condition, a structural reality, something that is analytically correct, but also obviously something that they would normatively also support, given that they are Asians. I think that the self-understanding of what is an Asian is something that is very dynamic, because only in the last 30 years have we begun to overcome the legacies of both colonialism and the Cold War, such that East Asians, Southeast Asians, South Asians, Central Asians, meaning the post-Soviet republics, and even West Asians, by which we often understand Arabs, Persians, and Turks, have started to see themselves truly as part of this greater Asian system that I described. As to whether or not the West has come around to this recognition, I think there's a de facto acceptance that Asia's rise is, again, a structural condition. But I don't think that we can speak about a unified Western psychology. There are some Americans who get it, there are others who don't. There are some Europeans who get it and others who don't. Most certainly there is a generational divide in the sense that you can see how younger people in the West have grown accustomed to this. Many of them have grown up learning Chinese in school. And then I think that there's also a political versus a business divide, where politicians are ambivalent about what it means, but business people have generally embraced it.
Thank you very much, Parag. Because of course, like you say, there's a generational divide between who you speak to in the West and the United States. So that's rightly put there. You also write that the election of Donald Trump as the US president in 2016 will see a profound rupture with previous decades of Western dominance. And you write that the US is more dispensable than it thinks. Let me put it to you that not all Asians wants to see this, because they're in this region, in Southeast Asia, in the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, depending on how you call it, there are many Asians who actually fear kind of a gradual American retrenchment from the region. How do you see this, Parag?
Well, first of all, the power shift has been a gradual process since the 1970s, even since before, obviously, the election of Donald Trump, even before the end of the Cold War. Geopolitically, we measure and look at the rise of the new economic and geoeconomic power centers dating back to Japan's post-war decades and the consolidation of the European Union. So there's nothing that anyone can do about this dissipation of power and this multipolarity. Now, in terms of, therefore, the US being dispensable, it's not a pejorative statement. It's a recognition of the fact that, again, Asia first is the sentiment that has been expressed, if not overtly, but has certainly been the agenda that has been pursued by Asian powers since the 1990s. To put their interests first, to focus on their economic development, to not let foreign strategic considerations upend their geoeconomic convergence and their collective rise towards prosperity. So we already see the Asia First agenda being the more important agenda in the world, and it was prior to the administration of Donald Trump. What I had said is, in fact, that the Anglo-American degeneration and delegitimation really dates back to the 2000s, in particular, the Western financial crisis, the populism, xenophobia, protectionism, Trump and Brexit being part and parcel of that, which only reinforces Asian self-confidence. This does not mean that America is not still a global superpower and that it is not highly relevant. And Asians, many Asians, are right to continue to see America as strategically relevant, financially relevant, technologically relevant, relevant in energy markets, relevant in agriculture markets, relevant in diplomacy, relevant in many ways. However, we must measure that relevance in each and every one of these verticals or issues. So rather than talk in an all-encompassing way about, America is indispensable or America is dispensable, let us clearly measure what contributions any power makes, whether it is America, whether it is Europe or others, to the overall stability and the prosperity of the region. And in that sense, we can measure Americans' relevance, and it remains highly relevant and positively and constructively so in some ways, but less so and more dispensable in other ways.
Excellent answer. I think also it's a question when we talk about relevance, it's a question of relativity as well, right? I mean, the US by far remains the foremost FDI investor into Southeast Asia, and by military spending, it kind of outstrips the spending of the next 6 great powers combined. So the US still has like considerable capabilities and abilities at its disposal. But at the same time, Asian countries, in particular China, are also stepping up to the plate instead of sticking out their position in the economic sphere and in political security sphere as well.
That's exactly right. And that's why it's important not just to look at static power issues like military spending or size of GDP and whether you are comparing GDP in US dollar terms or purchasing power parity terms. The real question is the context, the situation, the situational relevance, and as you say, the sort of the relative balance of contributions. And in the security sphere, there are countries that recognize China's legitimate right to expand its military, to defend its regional interests, its coastal interests, and so forth. And other powers are doing the same. Let's remember, India is doing the same, Japan is doing the same, Australia as well. Asia is nothing if not the world's largest arms bazaar of the moment. Then there's the economics, right? Countries, the United States is still the largest foreign investor in quite a few ASEAN countries, but China has become the largest trading partner. When you look at the what I call the 4th wave economies of the region, the 4th wave of growth, South and Southeast Asia, many of them, again, have also China as a large investor and a large trade partner, but growing technology and military and financial ties with the United States and with Europe. So the common thesis, the common denominator that I represent in my work is the idea of multi-alignment. Not choosing one side or the other because some people posit a new Cold War, but rather a very positionalist and self-interested approach by which Southeast Asian countries or in general emerging powers, whether it is India, Indonesia, or Vietnam or the Philippines, act in their own interest and choose to develop or to gain the maximum advantage from their existing relations with the United States, with China, with Japan, and others at the same time. And it is that self-interestedness, rather than deference to the interests of a greater power, that is the key psychological variable and new foundation of this post-colonial and post-Cold War world.
Excellent. And I think your point about not deference, but kind of a very heightened awareness of your self-interest is kind of harkens back to what Lord Palmerston said once, right? Countries do not have permanent alignments or alliances, but they have permanent national interests. And in a sense, what you are saying, Parag, is that Asian countries are just going back to what has been and what has always been the reality, is that as kind of the Cold War fades away into history, they are rediscovering the fact that it's not so much about alliances, it's not about alignments, but positioning themselves to maximize national interest.
And let's make clear that the recognition that countries do not have permanent alliances or interests is actually a very Asian insight in a way, or better reflective of Asian history than Western history. Because in Western history, of course, we have had very rigid alliances, and those have been one of the contributors to rigid escalation spirals, security dilemmas, and conflict. Whereas in Asia, there is no tradition of strong alliances among Asian civilizations or powers. There is, of course, a US-Japan alliance, which involves an extra-regional party, the United States. But within Asia, you do not see countries forming rigid alliances at all, not historically, not in the present, and not likely in the future. And so it's something that when we examine the geopolitics and the configurations of power in Asia, we should remember that it is actually extremely Asian to have this degree of fluidity that we have today, by which countries are naturally most interested in their own benefits and will not choose sides, but will play all sides, or decide to sit out, or if there is a conflict, to make their decisions based upon how they see the outcome of that conflict playing out. And again, that is a very classic Asian diplomatic strategy, much more than it is a Western one.
I'll call it the Zen and the art of alliance management. Is very fluid. It's not black and white. So that you hit the nail on the head, Parag. So that's an excellent point. Can we move to the fact to this problem of Sino-American rivalry? So, you know, whether it be Obama or Trump or Biden, we are seeing that the US has taken a kind of a consistent trajectory in its approach to China, singling out China as a strategic competitor. And some analysts were thinking that Biden might be kind of softer on China, but he's actually becoming quite Trumpian in his approach to China, in kind of the tariffs, the kind of alignments and the postures that Washington has taken. You seem to be quite sanguine in your assessment of Sino-American rivalry, arguing that interdependence and pragmatism will rule the day to prevent conflict. So can I ask, since you wrote the book in 2019, has your positions and views changed somewhat?
Well, actually, you know, my argument about the growing hawkishness or recognition of growing American hawkishness towards China dates back to the late Obama administration, not really to Trump. You know, Trump certainly escalated that and made it a rallying cry in his campaign and during his administration. That said, he wasn't necessarily as tough, quote unquote, on China as you see in some ways Biden being. So I'm not surprised by the continuity, let's say, because that has a lot to do with the structural shifts in China's power, with the perceptions of China's aggression in the region, and of course, the fact that American allies in the region are deeply concerned and have called upon the United States to have a stronger presence in the Indo-Pacific region. So to me, in terms of bilateral rivalry, I think that is less important than the broader context of the construction of the Quad relationship of countries across the Indo-Pacific, Japan, Australia, India, the United States, and other associated parties. One could even include, of course, the European countries that have been announcing their own Indo-Pacific strategies. So what you see is a broader coalition building that is a balance of Western and Eastern, that is, you know, pan-Indo-Pacific, that is quite global and mostly, you know, with democratic participating states. And the goal is to not, you know, of course, one is not using the word containment. In many of these dialogues, one does not even mention the name China. But the purpose is, of course, to collect like-minded states into a coalition that helps to preserve a geopolitical equilibrium, multipolar stability, and the rise of any particular hegemon in this region, which of course means China. And in that sense, that did begin much more strongly in earnest under the Trump administration. And I see that again as a structural reality. It does not matter if the next president of the United States is a Democrat or Republican. This is structurally determined, and I think that therefore the Quad alignment has strength. So it's not about being sanguine about U.S.-China relations. It's about seeing the context of action. The U.S.-China relations could become very violent very quickly, or the agenda could broaden, as it was during the Obama period, to cover dozens of issues in which both sides decide to step back from direct military confrontation and hopefully find ways to be competitive, but without violence. And that would obviously be a positive step, but it would not eliminate the perceived need and the actions that are being taken by Quad members and others to maintain a vigilant approach to trying to counter Chinese hegemonic behavior.
Excellent. And it's great that you mentioned the Quad, Parag, because we've seen the Quad go from from 0 to 60 miles an hour. Currently, we saw the Quad die in 2007 when Australia withdrew, and now the Quad has been back kind of since 2017. And they have Australia, Japan, India, the United States, and like you said, they are trying to bring on additional powers, be it France, Germany, the UK, Vietnam, Korea, and New Zealand. So do you think that the Quad actually has some legs to run? Because the Chinese are saying, the Chinese foreign minister has said that the Quad will actually dissipate like sea foam, like foam in the sea. So what's your assessment here?
Well, I mean, of course, the Chinese have only themselves to blame for the Quad gaining these legs that it has. And I want to give credit where credit is due. 20 years ago, when I was at the Brookings Institution as a young scholar, then President Strobe Talbot and then Senior Fellow Stephen Cohen, who is one of my mentors, both of them great South Asia experts in their own right, had given birth to a series of Track 2 dialogues with Japanese, Australian, and Indian diplomats. And at the time, we called it the global NATO. So 20 years later, we now have the Quad, but I was a direct observer of that early process. And so I think that whether or not one perceives it as being overly active or less than hyperactive at the moment, it is something that has been accruing and building for a couple of decades already. So I don't see it evaporating like sea foam at all. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the phase shift in the level of trust. You and I can remember the 1990s when China could make certain maneuvers in the South China Sea and then but then pull back and offer economic incentives to restore trust, such as the early harvest programs around the time of the Asian financial crisis. Today, I think we know that even though you have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that has been ratified last November, that does not mean that there is even this much more trust of China. So I think that there is a new permanent, again, psychological realization that even though China is a central, important neighbor, an anchor of the regional geopolitical and economic system, and that there is a great deal of dependence on China economically, there will not be any strategic trust of China at all moving forward. And that is a fundamentally different reality than the 1990s or even the early mid-2000s.
Yeah, excellent. Because I remember, again, like you, 20 years ago when I first started out, in the kind of the think tank world, the policy world, analysts were kind of throwing about terms like the US being a benign hegemon, it's a hegemon, but it's kind of benign and soft and cuddly, and they give us good stuff in the region, security and prosperity and all that. So China is kind of stepping up to the plate, and but you have this kind of conflicted approach to China in the sense that a lot of regional countries want the economic growth and the investment and the prosperity that China brings, but at the same time, they have this kind of apprehension towards China, especially when it's applied to the South China Sea. And to make a kind of a shameless self-plug here, Parag, in January, ISEAS published a survey called the State of Southeast Asia Survey. And basically, what the 1,032 respondents across Southeast Asia were saying is that 79% see China as the most important kind of political and strategic power in the region. But at the same time, about the same level, about 70+% see that as a concern. So I think that's a pretty stark kind of finding, don't you think, Parag?
I'm surprised that the answer was not 100% to both, right? Because again, I think these are obvious matters of fact. I think obviously you have an intelligent surveyed audience because it is an overwhelming proportion that sees reality for what it is. Power, therefore, is recognized, but power is also discomforting. And power, therefore, needs to be channeled, needs to be harnessed, needs to be shaped, needs to be, in some ways, countered. And that is why, over the last 15 years that I have been observing Chinese behavior and the responses to Chinese behavior, I've more and more come to articulate the approach by which you will ultimately have an equilibrium. You will not have a soft hegemony of the United States, nor will you have a hard hegemony of China. Instead, it is the reactions, the actions and the reactions that will ultimately bring us to a new kind of synthesis, to an equilibrium by which China is not able to dominate Asia in an aggressive fashion because of the counter reactions. And those counter reactions involve the military approaches such as the Quad, the growing investments in the self-defense capabilities that countries are making, but also economic shifts, of course, in terms of where countries choose to draw their investment from, new arrangements and infrastructural investments. China is not the only player in the marketplace for infrastructure finance. And we've seen that whereas Belt and Road has been an enormous investment by China, you also see the countermeasures taken by the United States, by Europe, by India, Japan, and others. And what that leads to is, again, a marketplace for infrastructure finance, a marketplace for these services. And I believe it is ultimately a geopolitical marketplace in which there will not be a single hegemon.
Excellent. And also, you in your parting shot of your book, Parag, which I enjoyed immensely, you were saying that there's a kind of synthesis and counter synthesis where you talk about the Chinese calling for a community of common destiny, and the kind of Americans and American friends of America calling for a global rules-based order. So we're kind of have these two grand narratives trying to be mashed together and trying to be kind of put as an overlay to the region. So we've yet to see, where we're going to go with that, because there's no conclusion here, right? Between the two.
I think the answer is there will be Asian rules, right, in the Asian space. And some of them build upon and draw on global codes of conduct and norms. For example, of course, in trade. We fret about the fate of the World Trade Organization globally, but of course, many World Trade Organization, sort of contributions to the playbook have shaped the RCEP and other trade agreements in the region. So that's an example of a rules-based order adaptation to Asia. We don't, however, see at the same time a strong presence of the United Nations, right? And nor necessarily the IMF, though the IMF has become more important since the pandemic, given the credit lines that it issues. So it's a mixed picture in terms of the adaptation of global rules. In terms of community of common destiny, that is, of course, a Chinese articulation, but I think that Asians, have a very mature understanding of the fact that the geography cannot be changed. They have 4,000 years of history in finding ways to shape each other's rise and to ensure that no single power has dominance for any period of time. As I always remind people, it's not since the 13th century that there was a truly universal dominant Asian power, the Mongols. And the Chinese tributary system is really of limited geographical and historical relevance. It certainly is not geographically encompassing the full Asian scope, and is therefore, to me, not a relevant precedent. Even if the Chinese may or may not like to see it that way, they cannot change geography. And then there is, again, the fact that many of the other key civilizations, not least, of course, India, see themselves as ascendant as well, and will provide a very strong counterweight. So yes, there's a common destiny geographically, economically, and even many of the positive, we should remember, cultural facets of interpenetration that have revived. And I view those as very significant. And I do believe that, and there are also surveys about this that I'm sure you're aware of, that reflect that even though one will always identify first and foremost by their nationality, that there is also a growing sense of a pan-Asian identity, that one is also an Asian. And I do think that's also significant. Will that prevent conflict? No, of course not necessarily, right? Interests are interests. Legacy conflicts that are unresolved from the pre-colonial and colonial and Cold War eras are still burning in the region. And one or more of them may indeed escalate into outright warfare. That does not derail the broader Asian growth story. If there is a war in Taiwan, if there is a war over the Spratly Islands, if North Korea collapses, of course we will see a scramble for influence. We will see a reordering of geopolitical power relations in those specific geographies. But does it mean that all of Asia has fallen apart? Of course not. quite frankly, and this is one of the more controversial points that I've made in previous books, is that, in the study of political geography, ultimately, we have had a tripling of the number of states since the end of World War II. And after you have a conflict, you also have a settlement. And I look forward to that settlement. And I hope that that settlement to each of these disputes comes peacefully. But even if there is war, let us remember there will also be settlement. And history moves on and a new equilibrium is achieved.
Thanks for that. Parag, can we just move on to what you wrote about Southeast Asia and ASEAN? You make quite a pointed kind of commentary in your book where you say that poor ASEAN states like Laos and Cambodia have exchanged their strategic autonomy for Chinese cash. Now, that's a pretty strong statement. Would you kind of give us a bit more elaboration on what you mean by that?
Well, I mean, first of all, small states bordering large powers don't actually have strategic autonomy, and of course, these are countries that have been in the immediate previous generation, among the worst victims of the Cold War rivalries and so forth. So I don't really think of them as strategically autonomous to begin with. The question is, how are they managing their sovereignty in an age of rising Chinese power and encroachment on their natural resources, on their economies, and so forth. And this is where I advocate that even the weakest states, whether it is Kyrgyzstan or Mongolia or Laos, need to obviously preserve those aspects of sovereignty and use sovereignty in their own self-interest to avoid their natural resources from being completely exploited, from avoiding excessive debt traps, and so forth. And that's what, again, even the weakest states should do. That's what Laos and Cambodia should do in their own interest. Whether or not they are going to develop the diplomatic maturity and the lack of corruption and the institutional capacity that it takes to act in one's own interest in a regular, consistent fashion over time, such that despite weakness, despite vulnerability, which Singapore also obviously has, that one nonetheless can punch above one's weight. And that's something that I advocate. And again, it's something that I've seen play out across the region. If you look at the ways in which Vietnam or the Philippines or Kazakhstan, even Pakistan, countries that have depended on China, that have had good relations with China, Vietnam obviously is not, but these countries have put limits on the amount of foreign ownership of their strategic assets that China can have. And they have ensured that where there is Chinese investment, they are trying to use it to build up their own capacity and strength so that they can have greater agency in resisting hegemony. And that is what even the weakest countries can do, and something that I believe is in the interest of Singapore, in the interest of ASEAN countries, to support the sovereignty and the capacity of its weakest members.
Great, that's a great answer. Can I just ask, so beyond Laos and beyond Cambodia and Southeast Asia, of course, you mentioned Singapore, they are the bigger country, ASEAN states like Vietnam and Indonesia and the Philippines. How do you see them kind of managing the Chinese problem, if you like? Because countries like Vietnam, countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore, they do have some considerable kind of domestic capacities, whether it's economic or social or political. So as you and I know, it's kind of the politics or geopolitics is kind of, having your cake and eat it at the same time. You maintain national resilience, which enables you to kind of manage the kind of influence peddling and kind of influence of a greater power. So how do you see the kind of more established ASEAN member states playing out in this kind of China game?
Well, I think there's two answers. The first, initially you alluded to ASEAN as an organization. And as we know, even the most mature regional organizations, even supranational ones like the European Union, have a very hard time speaking with one voice when it comes to military and diplomatic affairs. So our expectations of ASEAN as a regional grouping, as a secretariat, should rightly be very, very low. And indeed, they are very low. But now it comes down to the individual states. And again, this is not just building the domestic capacity, but the international capacity. So should ASEAN countries see the common interest in the environmental security of the Mekong River Delta and having a common position vis-a-vis China, or in terms of supporting the most affected states in terms of managing flood levels, droughts and agricultural systems and this kind of thing. This is what they should do together. Whether it is under the direct auspices and supervision of ASEAN or whether it's bilateral is a secondary consideration. But is it an abiding interest that Thailand, help Laos in this regard, and Vietnam help Laos and itself, and others help Vietnam? Yes. So there are areas of strategic mutual, interest among ASEAN states. And again, the wealthier ones should be helping the weaker ones. We can see this as well in financial regulation or in trade finance, simply modernizing the regulations so that there could be a more effective pan-ASEAN financial liquidity of capital and, build up the reserves in each other's currencies or in a pan-ASEAN type of coin, if you will. This would also help to build the capacity of these countries. So in all of these areas, I would like to see a lot more functional cooperation among ASEAN states. And again, there are ones with very strong capacity. And of course, Singapore ranks at the top of that list, but we see Malaysia as well weathering its political storms. Malaysia is a wealthy country. It has a diversified economy. Thailand also has maintained its stability, and it's going through wide range of reforms, even under the military leadership in terms of its infrastructure investment and economic diversification, which are quite positive. Indonesia, obviously, as well. So there is plenty of capacity within ASEAN for the strong countries to not only continue on the positive path they are on, but to also help lift up their neighbors.
So what you're saying, Parag, is essentially don't bother with the labels, whether it's ASEAN being kind of an intergovernmental organization or the EU being supranational. But, that's a basic theme of your book, which is, let's put aside the kind of the noise and fury of democracies. Let's think about what policies work. Let's think about how technocrats can actually carry out the functions to make things work rather than look at the labels. So, and given that you've mentioned about functional cooperation, you've spoken about the Mekong, you've spoken about kind of financial reserves, you just dangled it in front of me now. So what kind of functional traction do you think ASEAN or individual ASEAN member states can get on Myanmar at the moment, which is quite problematic?
It is, but it isn't the first Myanmar crisis of the last 15, 20 years. We've had Cyclone Nargis. We had, of course, their unrest around the time where the monks had an uprising as well. We had an unstable democratic transition and so forth. And there's been, a lot of constant concerns over the last 15 years about which entities would be on and off of blacklists and so on. And we have not had a unified position between ASEAN countries, the United States, and of course, certainly not China. So I don't think that, this is again a perfectly valid example of the thesis that you will not have a common ASEAN position. Countries like Singapore that have assets in the country that have been selected as critical vendors for infrastructure projects, are not going to cease their activities. Those companies that have been involved in the modernization of the telecommunications infrastructure, like Samsung of Korea and others, are not going to pull back their operations. They're going to continue because they understand that whether or not this junta has seized power back, which of course it never really let go of, for only the next 24 months, or whether it's again a setback that's going to last another decade, there is an interest, a self-interest, but also an interest for the people of the country that those investments continue because they do in fact improve life in the country. And this is a debate that is being waged right now over Myanmar, but also about, of course, Xinjiang and whether or not European firms in particular in the retail and apparel industry or automotive industry should continue their investments. As a rule of thumb, now eliminating the geographic focus on Asia, as a rule of thumb, the ways in which countries ultimately do change their laws and regulations, and the ways in which labor conditions and other rights are improved for people is through direct foreign investment. It isn't by sanctions. It isn't by writing lots of reports that tell them what to do and emailing them those reports. You actually have to roll up your sleeves and go into those countries. So I know that it isn't popular or politically correct. But in a context where you can, and a lot of people will cite examples like South Africa, but when a country is truly isolated like South Africa, then divestment campaigns and these kinds of leverage can actually have an impact. But when you're talking about a context where China is going to take the opposite side of the bargain in any attempt to isolate a country, that approach is not going to work, especially if it's within China itself. And of course, Myanmar too. So we have to get real. And I've always believed in the following phrase, which is put your money where your mouth is. And I use that phrase when I'm in Washington. I use that phrase when I'm in Brussels or London. And I use that phrase here, actually, in ASEAN as well. However, I believe that ASEAN leaders are, again, quite pragmatic, if not technocratic. And they take the long-term view. And they do believe that one has to roll with the punches of the shifting political landscape in a country and focus on the needs of that country, which very much involve infrastructure investment, modernization, trade facilitation, and so forth. And I want to see that continue, even despite the horrific tragedy of what's happening in Myanmar right now, because I don't want to punish the people. We should always focus on regimes, not people, when it comes to punitive actions.
Yeah, so I can't agree with you more, because it seems like kind of the Western and American take on Myanmar is kind of like, I talk to American diplomats and they say, well, we're not going to talk to the junta unless we go back to kind of pre-February 1st. And, you know, that's just not the way to go about it if you want to bring things forward. I mean, I think the accepted wisdom is that the junta has to be part of the equation, you know, going forward. You can't just shunt aside the junta, and, you know, investments, dialogue needs to carry on despite what has happened.
I mean, it's a tragic continuity of a bad set of ideologies, and you can't bring Iran back to 1978, and you can't bring Cuba back to the 1940s. But this is the way, you know, as you know, this is sort of the lawfare approach, as it's known. Is you know, unfortunately, you know, just a characteristic of not just American thinking. It's pan-Western in some capitals, though Europeans, because they border on some of these regions more, like Russia and Iran and others, they tend to have a more pragmatic approach and realize that engagement is better. And by and large, again, in the spirit of the phrase, put your money where your mouth is, engagement should be the default rather than abstention, sanctions, and attempts at isolation. Again, isolation does not work in a landscape of multi-alignment.
Thank you. Now, Parag, we just have about 5 more minutes, and I'd like to dedicate this 5 minutes to your kind of chapter on technocratic systems and Singapore, and it's kind of what you call the Singapore model. And of course, you write that kind of the Singapore model of technocratic governance is more about tangible delivery outputs than democratic inputs for their own sake. And you write that technocracy is a form of salvation after societies realize that democracy doesn't always guarantee success. Now, this, of course, I'm sure will be very encouraging to Singapore policymakers as well as other countries that want to follow the Singapore model. My question for you is, do you think it can be replicated given that Singapore is actually such a small country and governable?
It's a great question. Now, it's not about replicating exactly Singapore-style technocracy, though, of course, as you and I know, a great many public officials, whether they are mayors or provincial leaders or cabinet level and functionally responsible bureaucrats from all across the region, from China, from India, Kazakhstan, Russia, and all across, do come to Singapore to study urban planning, to study policy, to study public administration at the Lee Kuan Yew School and elsewhere, and I applaud that. It is a direct sign that a small country can influence a big country, because we're simply talking about professionalization of bureaucracy. It has no, the question of whether a country is large or small really is irrelevant. And the fact that, of course, China was inspired by Singapore in the late 1970s and 1980s is itself, of course, the strongest counter argument to the idea that small countries cannot influence large countries. So I reject that both, you know, theoretically, empirically, you know, historically, and intellectually. There's no basis for the argument. It's really about learning and adapting the lessons. So many countries are trying very hard to adopt the best practices that they see in Singapore or that they see in Japan or other successful modern countries. Quite frankly, a lot of countries have been copying Chinese-style industrial policy and realizing that that has been the pathway for China since the 1980s, setting up more special economic zones and so forth. I documented this carefully in a previous book that the number of special economic zones has absolutely skyrocketed since the 60s and 70s. And much of it does, of course, have to do with witnessing how China managed to leverage those into the modernization and strengthening of its own domestic industrial base. So again, I am a believer. Obviously, I've admired Singapore since long before I ever came to become a resident here, and I've appreciated it even more now. And I see even more lessons that others can adopt at that micro technical level. And that is why technocrats are important, because it has to be done in the context of building institutions and bureaucracies that have institutional memory, not on the basis of one individual leader's whim. And that is ultimately the distinction and the difference between a system in which everything is about personalities versus one where it's about institutions. And whenever, and we're also talking about Western countries now in particular, when you hear, well, Boris Johnson is doing this, and so forth, I immediately fear that we're not talking about what is the British system doing and how is the British system recovering the technocratic strength and influence that its civil service had straight up through the 1970s. And if that is not the problem that is being addressed, then I fear for Great Britain, no matter how scintillatingly popular Boris Johnson may be because of one vaccine campaign or the other. And the same thing applies to country after country. So it is about systems, not about people. And in that spirit, really, every country can learn and to become in a way more like Switzerland. And I make this point precisely because I want to emphasize that I do not see a tension between technocracy and democracy. Because in my study of this subject, the two foremost what I call direct technocracies are indeed Singapore and Switzerland. Now, Switzerland is a thoroughly democratic state, the most democratic country in the world, but it has such strong public institutions, and it has 7 heads of state at any given time, and most people can't even name who they are. So the fact is, the belief lies in the system and the continuity of the system. And I like to think that Singapore has achieved that in terms of its bureaucracy, right? Singapore can indeed run itself. And therefore, in this transition towards the 4G and beyond, it does ultimately matter less who the prime minister is at a given moment than the resilience in the system. And this is really one of the only countries that's invested so much in making the system stronger rather than letting it atrophy. And that, to me, is the fundamental lesson of the importance of technocracy.
Thanks for that, Parag. I like what you said. I actually wrote in the book about how Singapore technocrats are trained to actually use their head, their heart, as well as their hands. I think that's an excellent way of actually putting it. But also, I think I'm beginning to understand what you say about, the Singapore system is not 100%. You can't replicate it 100%. But what you are doing is you're taking kind of best practices and policies that have worked, and you're trying to replicate it in a different country, different context, different circumstances. That's what you're saying, right?
Exactly right. And again, that's what smart countries are out to do. We may not see the immediate results at the top level in India, but we see, again, their focus on special economic zones, their focus on infrastructure investment, their focus on law and order, these kinds of things. Now, we may not like, many people do not like Prime Minister Modi for a wide range of perfectly valid and legitimate reasons. However, one can also see the process of state building that is underway in that country that has been neglected for far too long. We can see the influence of Singapore in the Arab world, where I spend a lot of time and quite active in advising the Gulf governments. They see enormous inspiration from the Singapore example, even though they are larger in many respects and have different economic compositions and certainly very different political systems, because they are, of course, monarchic states. Nonetheless, despite the vast differences across regime types, we see countries learning at that functional level. And that is the level at which we should focus in order to genuinely see improvements in governance.
Thank you very much, Parag. I know that you're watching the clock because we are running out of time, but this was a really enjoyable discussion on kind of wider trends of Asia, the rise of Asia, Sino-American rivalry, ASEAN, the European Union, and kind of revenge of the technocrats, if you can put it that way. So really enjoyed this conversation, and thanks again for making our time, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Likewise. Thank you, William. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Parag. Bye for now.
Take care.
Bye. Take care. Bye.